They say money can't buy happiness, but in my family, it could certainly buy a very convincing mask. On my 32nd birthday, I received a wire transfer for exactly $50,000 from an anonymous LLC. No note, no name, just a digital footprint leading back to a town I hadn't stepped foot in for a decade. While most guys my age were worried about their $401,000 or a mortgage in the suburbs of Chicago, I was staring at a screen, realizing that someone was paying for my silence before I even knew I had a secret to keep. Up until that moment, my life was exactly how I wanted it, quiet. I'm a mid-level architect at a firm in the Loop. I spend my days obsessing over load-bearing walls and natural light, living in a one-bedroom apartment that smells like espresso and old blueprints. In the high-octane world of the Seattle Thorns, I was considered the failure, the one who walked away from the family real estate empire to actually build things instead of just flipping them for a profit. The only person who didn't look at my W-2 as a scorecard was Silas. My grandfather was a man of rough edges and hidden depths, a self-made titan who built his first skyscraper when sustainability wasn't even a word. Every Sunday, regardless of how much my cousins Julian and Claire tried to monopolize his time, Silas would call me. We wouldn't talk about aggressive acquisitions or the S&P 500. We'd talk about the integrity of a structure, how a building is only as strong as the stuff you can't see beneath the surface. Mason, he'd tell me in that gravelly voice of his. Most people spend their lives decorating the penthouse while the foundation is rotting. Don't be most people. I thought I understood what he meant. I thought we were just talking about architecture. I didn't realize he was preparing me for the structural collapse of everything I called family, that $50,000 wasn't a gift. It was a warning shot, and the man who sent it was likely sitting at Silas's bedside, waiting for him to take his last breath. The phone call didn't come at 3 o'clock a.m. like in the movies. It came at 10:14 on a Tuesday morning, right in the middle of a design review. The caller ID just said Thorne Manor. I didn't even have to pick it up to know that the anchor of my world had finally let go. Silas was 88, a long, storied run, but the silence on the other end of the line felt heavier than any building I'd ever designed. The funeral was held on a Tuesday that felt more like a burial of the spirit than a celebration of life. We stood in a cemetery in Bellevue, tucked away in an enclave of old money where the trees are so thick they block out the sun even when it's not raining. But that day, the sky was a bruised charcoal, dumping a steady, freezing drizzle onto our black umbrellas. I stood at the edge of the grave, my boots sinking into the soft, hungry mud. Across from me stood Julian and Claire. They looked like they were posing for a Vanity Fair spread on grief and glamour. Claire was adjusting her designer veil, her eyes scanning the crowd to see which local politicians had shown up. Julian was worse. Even as the priest was reciting the final commendation, I could see his thumb dancing across his phone screen. He wasn't texting condolences. He was checking the PI market real estate listings. I leaned in to offer Claire a hand as she stepped over a puddle, but she pulled back as if my Chicago-bought coat might stain her silk. It's a shame, she whispered, not to me, but to Julian. The maintenance costs on the sound property are going to eat into the liquid assets if we don't list it by Friday. Already handled, Julian muttered, his voice cold and clinical. The surveyor is coming tomorrow. Silas wouldn't want us to be sentimental. They were talking about his life's work like it was a carcass to be butchered. There was no mention of his wisdom, his laugh, or the way he used to smell like cedar wood and old books. They were already dividing the spoils before the first shovel of dirt hit the mahogany casket. I realized then that I wasn't just mourning my grandfather. I was mourning the illusion that these people had any hearts left to break. The air in the offices of Sterling, Vance and Associates was thin and smelled of expensive floor wax and old, dusty sachets. We were seated in a room that looked like it had been designed to intimidate anyone making less than 7 figures. Julian took the head of the table, naturally, leaning back with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He had this air of a victor returning from a crusade, already mentally spending money that wasn't his yet. Let's make this quick, Julian said, glancing at his gold Patek Philippe. I have a 2 o'clock p.m. meeting with a developer from San Francisco. They're looking at the estate on the Sound for a boutique resort. It's a $6.5 million valuation, easy. I sat there, my hands folded, feeling like an outsider in my own bloodline. Claire was nodding, already scrolling through interior design portfolios for her new Manhattan loft. To them, The Thorne homestead, the place where Silas taught me how to use a compass, and where we spent every Christmas morning, was just a line item on a balance sheet. The expectation was unanimous. The $2 million in liquid assets and the property would be split 3 ways. A clean, clinical divorce from our history. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Harrison, who looked like he'd been carved out of the same mahogany as his desk, cleared his throat. He adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable. Before we proceed to the distribution, Harrison began, his voice echoing in the sterile room. Silas requested that I remind you all of one thing. A house is only as stable as the soil it sits on. Julian rolled his eyes. Spare us the metaphors, Harrison. Just get to the numbers. We know the drill. 33% each, house to the highest bidder. Let's sign the papers. The smirk on Julian's face was so wide it was almost a snarl. He truly believed he had won. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the validation that his greed was smart business. I looked at the thick manila envelope on the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. I kept thinking about that anonymous $50,000 wire transfer. Julian looked too confident, too comfortable. He thought he'd already bought the outcome. He had no idea the foundation was about to give way, Mr. Harrison didn't look up. He simply turned a page, the crisp sound of paper cutting through the room's tension like a blade. Regarding the primary residence located at 1422 Shoreline Drive and the remaining liquid capital, totaling $3.8 million, he paused. And for a split second, Julian actually leaned forward, his hand hovering near his pen as if he were ready to snatch the keys right there. I hereby bequeath these assets in their entirety, Harrison continued, to my grandson, Mason Thorne. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was vacuum sealed. Julian's smirk didn't just fade. It disintegrated. He looked like he'd been struck in the chest. Claire let out a sharp, jagged gasp, her phone clattering onto the hardwood floor. Wait, that's a typo, Julian stammered, his voice rising an octave, the polished executive mask finally cracking. That's impossible. Mason hasn't even lived in this state for 10 years. He's a draft checker in Chicago. There's a mistake. There is no mistake, Mr. Thorne, Harrison said coldly, sliding a single handwritten sheet of paper across the table. It was Silas's stationery. My eyes blurred as I recognized that bold architectural script, however. The lawyer added, his voice dropping to a low, somber tone, there is a codicil, a condition that must be met before the title is transferred. Mason, your grandfather has requested that you reside in the house for exactly 40 nights alone. You are to touch nothing, sell nothing, and invite no one inside until the 41st morning. And there is a final instruction. You must find the hollow heart of the house before the time is up. If you fail to stay, or if you fail to find it, the entire estate reverts to a blind trust for the preservation of Pacific maritime history. I looked at Julian. His face was a terrifying shade of purple, his eyes darting between me and the lawyer. He wasn't just angry. He looked panicked. I realized then that the hollow heart wasn't just a metaphor from an old architect. It was a threat. Silas hadn't just left me a house. He'd left me a crime scene, and I had 40 days to figure out what was buried in the walls. The heavy office door had barely clicked shut behind us when the hallway became a kill zone. The Thorne dignity evaporated in the time it took to reach the elevators. Julian didn't even wait for the doors to open. He spun on his heel, his face inches from mine, smelling of expensive bourbon and desperate rage. You think you're a genius, don't you? He hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl. You think you can just swoop in from your pathetic little life in Chicago and steal what we've been maintaining for a decade? That $50,000 I sent you, that was a courtesy. It was a stay-away fee. You should have taken the hint, Mason. You don't belong in this league, so it was him. The anonymous wire transfer was a bribe I hadn't even known I was accepting. But it was Claire who cut the deepest. She stepped forward, her eyes cold as a winter morning on the Sound. She didn't scream. She spoke with a clinical, razor-sharp condescension that was far worse. Look at you, Mason, she said, gesturing to my scuffed leather boots and my of-the-wreck coat. You're an architect who designs strip malls and public libraries. You live in a rented box. You're mediocre. You have no idea how to manage an estate like this. You'll be underwater on property taxes within 6 months. She stepped closer, the scent of her $400 perfume cloying and suffocating. Silas was old. He was losing his grip. He chose you because you were the only one weak enough to listen to his senile stories. Giving you this house is like giving a vintage Ferrari to a toddler. You don't deserve his legacy, Mason. You're just a sentimental glitch in the system. If you have any dignity left, you sign that house over to us tonight and go back to your blueprints before we make your life very, very difficult. I looked at them, these people who shared my blood, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like their failed relative. I felt like the only one in the hallway who was actually human. The clock starts tonight, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I'll see you both in 40 days. If there's anything left of you by then. I walked toward the elevators, their insults echoing of the marble walls. Realizing that the wolves weren't at the door, they were already in the family tree, and they were terrified of what I might find in that house. The first night in Thorne Manor felt like living inside the ribcage of a giant. The house was a masterpiece of cedar and glass perched over the black water of the Sound, but without Silas, it was freezing. I spent the first week following his rule. Touch nothing. I sat in the dark, listening to the house groan, wondering what a hollow heart looked like in a structure this massive. By the 10th night, I found myself in Silas's private study room. Julian and Claire were always forbidden to enter. It was a sanctuary of drafting tables and old vellum maps. As an architect, I started doing what I do best, analyzing the floor plan. Something was off. The depth of the built-in bookshelves didn't match the exterior wall's thickness. There was a dead space of 4-inch gap that shouldn't exist. I knelt by the heavy oak desk, running my fingers along the grain of the floorboards. Most were tongue and groove, tight as a drum. But near the corner, one board had a microscopic bevel. I used my drafting scale to provide just enough leverage, and the wood groaned before popping upward. I expected stacks of cash, or perhaps a hidden stash of gold coins. Instead, I found a row of 3 leather-bound journals, wrapped in archival plastic. I spent the rest of the night under the glow of a single desk lamp, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. These weren't diaries about his garden or his health. They were a forensic audit of the family business. Thorne Development Group. Silas had been playing a long game. Detailed in his meticulous script were the receipts of Julian's success. For 5 years, Julian hadn't been a visionary. He'd been a parasite. He'd created a network of shell companies, Blue Horizon LLC, Nautilus Group, to overbuild the estate's construction projects. He hadn't just been skimming. He'd been hemorrhaging the family's wealth into offshore accounts to cover his own gambling debts and failed tech investments. The total was staggering. $1.2 million. Silas knew. He had documented every wire transfer, every forged signature, and every ghost employee Julian had put on the payroll. I sat back in Silas's chair, the weight of the journals in my lap. The $50,000 Julian sent me wasn't just to keep me away from the house. It was a desperate attempt to keep me from this room. He knew Silas was onto him, and he was terrified that the mediocre architect would be the one to find the blueprints of his downfall. I sat there in the pale grey light of a Washington dawn. The journal spread out like a roadmap of a car crash. At 32, you're supposed to be in the prime of your life, but I felt like I was holding a live grenade. I had enough evidence in my lap to send Julian to a federal penitentiary for a decade and strip Claire of every designer asset she owned. I could burn it all down. I could be the wrecking ball they never saw coming. The anger was seductive. I thought about the way they looked at me in that hallway, the mediocre cousin, the failure. I wanted to see the look on Julian's face when the handcuffs clicked. I wanted to see Claire's social circle evaporate when the word embezzlement hit the headlines of the Seattle Times. But then, I looked around the room. I saw the sketches Silas had pinned to the walls, designs for low-income housing and community centers he built 40 years ago. I remembered his voice, echoing through the rafters of my memory. Mason, a building that's built on spite will never stand straight. You don't design for the ego. You design for the soul. Silas didn't give me this house to be a weapon. He didn't turn me into a private investigator just so I could seek revenge. He gave me this place to be a sanctuary for me, and for the legacy he actually cared about. If I used this to destroy them, I was just becoming another version of them. I'd be using the Thorne name to cause more wreckage, but I couldn't just walk away either. If I stayed silent, the rot Julian had started would eventually consume everything Silas built. I had to find a third way. I had to be the architect of a different kind of justice, one that didn't just punish the past, but protected the future. I looked at the phone on the desk. I had 28 nights left in this house. 28 nights to decide if I was going to be the man who fired the shot, or the man who finally fixed the foundation. On the 40th night, I broke the silence. I sent a simple, short text to Julian and Claire. I'm tired of the Cold War. Come to the house at 7 p.m. Let's discuss a settlement for the deed. The bait was too shiny for them to resist. By 7:05 p.m., Julian's black SUV was idling in the driveway. They walked into the foyer like they already owned the place, their heels clicking on the hardwood with a predatory rhythm. I had set the dining table, the massive, hand-carved cedar slab Silas loved, and opened a bottle of 2012 Cabernet that had been aging in the cellar for a decade. The atmosphere was suffocating. Julian sat across from me, his smile as sharp as a razor and just as hollow. He poured himself a glass of wine, swirling it with the practiced ease of a man who thinks he's already won the negotiation. I knew you'd come around. Mason, Julian said, his voice dripping with faux brotherly warmth. Living in this mausoleum alone, it changes a man. You realize you're out of your depth. Claire and I have prepared a fair exit package. $250,000 cash, plus we'll cover your moving expenses back to Chicago. You can go back to your little sketches, and we'll handle the heavy lifting of the estate. Claire leaned in, her eyes shimmering with a terrifying, artificial kindness. We just want what's best for the family legacy, Mason. You aren't built for this world. Why spend your 30s fighting legal battles you can't win? I watched them. I watched the way they exchanged a quick, triumphant glance when I didn't immediately argue. I was looking for a flicker of remorse, a single mention of Silas that wasn't about his money. Nothing. They were just waiting for me to pick up the pen. They were so busy calculating their next move that they didn't notice the 3 leather-bound journals sitting in the shadows of the sideboard, just inches away from the candlelight. Before I sign anything, I said, leaning back and meeting Julian's gaze, I have to ask, Julian, that $50,000 you sent me for my birthday, was that out of love, or was it a down payment on my soul? The wine glass froze halfway to Julian's lips. The mask didn't just slip. It cracked. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I simply reached over to the sideboard and placed the 3 leather journals on the cedar table, right next to Julian's wine glass. The thud they made sounded like a gavel hitting a block. What is this? Julian asked, though I could see the sudden, frantic pulse in his neck. It's a masterclass in structural failure, I said quietly. I opened the second volume to a bookmarked page, the one where Silas had meticulously tracked the Blue Horizon LLC payments. Specifically, the $450,000 you siphoned out of the Sound Development Fund over the last 18 months. Silas wasn't senile, Julian. He was an architect. He knew exactly how much material it took to build a dream. And he knew exactly how much you were stealing to pay off your own nightmares. The blood drained from Julian's face so fast I thought he might faint. The cocky, high-powered executive vanished, replaced by a man who looked like he'd just stepped off a ledge in the dark. Beside him, Claire froze, her hand trembling as she reached for her glass. She looked at the numbers, the dates, the forged signatures, evidence so clean it would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Mason, listen. Julian's voice was a pathetic, thin rasp. The power shift was so absolute, it was almost sickening. 5 minutes ago, he was offering me a consolation prize. Now, he was looking at me like I held his very life in my hands. No, you listen, I interrupted, my voice as cold and steady as the deep water outside. I'm not here to shout. I'm not here to hear your excuses about why you felt entitled to gut Silas's hard work. I'm here because I'm the owner of this house. The owner of the company shares Silas left me, and the only person in this room who isn't going to jail tonight if you follow my lead. The room went silent, save for the sound of the rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in 32 years, I wasn't the quiet cousin from Chicago. I was the one holding the blueprints. And Julian and Claire were finally realizing that the foundation they'd been standing on had been a lie all along. I didn't call the police. I didn't file a lawsuit. Silas had spent a lifetime building the Thorne name, and I wasn't going to let the final chapter be a tabloid headline about embezzlement and greed. Instead, I gave them a choice, the Blue Horizon exit. Julian had 48 hours to liquidate his assets, pay back every cent he'd stolen into a trust for Silas's charitable foundations, and resign from the board. Claire had the same window to sign over her remaining interest in the estate. You disappear, I told them as they stood by the door, looking smaller than I ever thought possible. No more family gatherings. No more consultation fees. No more lies. You get to keep your freedom, but you lose the name. They left without a word. No more insults about my mediocre life. The silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was clean. Now, I'm standing on the wraparound porch, leaning against the cedar railing Silas installed himself. The storm has finally moved inland, leaving the sky over the sound a bruised palette of violet and gold. There is sharp with salt and the scent of damp earth. I am 32 years old, and my life in Chicago feels like a lifetime ago. I've resigned from the firm. I'm going to stay here and finish the projects Silas started, the ones that actually matter. The ones that provide a roof for people who have nothing, not just a view for people who have too much. I lost the family I thought I had, but standing here, I realize I've gained something far more structural. I found my own worth, not in the digits of a bank account or the prestige of a title, but in the integrity of the truth. The house is finally quiet, the foundation is solid, and for the first time in my life, I'm not just drawing the plans, I'm living them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments.